Okay folks, today we're going to talk about blue-green deployments. I'm going to describe what a blue-green deployment is, and then we're going to talk about 5 different techniques for carrying out blue-green deployments, as well as when is the wrong time to carry out a blue-green deployment. I want to start out by noting that all these ideas came from a white paper put out by AWS. It's called Blue-Green Deployments on AWS. So a blue-green deployment is a technique for updating an application from one version to another. So the basic premise is that you have 2 environments. One is called the blue environment. This is your current production environment, or like the old version. And then one is called your green environment, which is the new environment with the updated application. And there's lots of ways to carry out a blue-green deployment, but all of them involve eventually shifting traffic from your blue environment to your green environment, and then back if you find a problem. How quickly you can shift that traffic, how quickly you can roll back if you find a problem, and the amount of extra resources needed during the deployment process vary from technique to technique, and we'll explore that. So in a minute here, we'll dive into the 5 different techniques I want to talk about for carrying out blue-green deployments. But first I want to define just a key important term. So that is immutable infrastructure. Immutable infrastructure is talking about an approach to managing deployments in which your components are replaced rather than changed. This is important in blue-green deployments. Alright, so what are the 5 methods we're going to talk about today? Number 1, updating DNS routing with Amazon Route 53. Number 2, swapping the autoscaling group behind your Elastic Load Balancer. Number 3, updating the launch configuration behind your autoscaling groups. Number 4 only applies if you're using Elastic Beanstalk, but it's by swapping the environment of an Elastic Beanstalk application. And number 5, cloning a stack in AWS OpsWorks and updating DNS. Okay, so method number 1 is updating DNS routing with AWS Route 53. So in this method, you update your DNS records to alter the balance of traffic being sent between your 2 environments. So you could send all your traffic over to the green environment immediately and at once. It's often a better idea to start with just a small portion of your traffic. Watch it carefully, make sure things are going okay with that small subset of traffic in the green environment, and then gradually bring the rest in from blue. So one nice thing about this technique is that it allows you to shift traffic back toward your blue environment if you do notice something weird in the green environment. Alright, so our second method is where you swap autoscaling groups. So if you don't want to or you can't update your DNS records, another option is to use separate autoscaling groups for your blue and green environments. So in this technique, you start with a small autoscaling group for your green environment and then gradually increase its size to encourage the load balancer to send it more and more traffic. That means this technique gives you a little bit of control over the way you shift traffic from one environment to the other, though it's not as granular as the DNS routing technique. As you shift the balance of traffic from your blue towards your green environment, you can decommission instances in your blue environment either by terminating them or putting them in a standby state. So although putting your blue instances in standby is not quite as effective as terminating them outright, I still recommend it because if you find an issue in the green environment, you can change their state back to re-engage them. Alright, the third method is updating your launch configurations. Let's start with defining what a launch configuration is. A launch configuration is a set of specifications for an autoscaling group that includes, among other things, the Amazon machine image or AMI ID and the EC2 instance type. So when you update the launch configuration associated with an autoscaling group, instances with an older launch configuration are prioritized for decommissioning versus instances with the newest launch configuration for whenever autoscaling removes instances. So there is at least one exception to this rule, and that's when your instances are spread in a really unbalanced way across availability zones. In that case, AWS actually might decommission an instance with the newest launch configuration before it decommissions one with an older launch configuration, just to try and get things geographically balanced again. Okay, so how can you use launch configuration updates to carry out a blue-green deployment? So start by updating the green autoscaling group to use the newest launch configuration. Then scale it up to contain the amount of instances you ultimately want production to include, which is probably double what the green environment currently has. If you're considering blue had X number of instances and green will need that same number, we'll end up with 2 times that as the size of the autoscaling group temporarily. So at this point you'll have your untouched blue autoscaling group with instances using the old launch configuration, and then you'll have about twice as many instances with the new launch configuration in your green autoscaling group. Your next step is to start scaling back the size of the green autoscaling group. As you pull this back, autoscaling should prioritize decommissioning instances with the old launch configuration, which you're going to find in the blue autoscaling group. The idea is that in the end, all the instances from the old blue environment with the old launch configuration have been removed, and so all your remaining instances have the newest launch configuration, just like you want. Okay, so method 4, swapping the Beanstalk environment. When you update an application that you spun up using Elastic Beanstalk, typically Elastic Beanstalk is going to carry that update out in place, which means your application might be unavailable to some users for a short period of time. To avoid that downtime, you can deploy the new version of the application to a separate environment rather than updating it in place. When you do this, the blue environment's configurations are copied to create the green environment with the updated version of the application. One nice thing is that the green environment will have its own URL. When you're ready to promote your green environment to be the production environment, you can use Beanstalk's Swap Environment URLs feature. Once the switch is complete and you verified things are looking good in your green environment, you can terminate your blue environment and you're done. The last technique I want to talk about is cloning a stack in OpsWorks and then updating DNS. So in AWS OpsWorks, a stack is just a logical grouping of resources such as EC2 instances or Elastic Load Balancers, that kind of thing. You can carry out a blue-green deployment by cloning your blue stack and using it to create your green stack with an updated version of the application. Right after you clone the blue stack, the green stack will exist but won't be receiving any traffic. You can take a look at it, make sure it looks the way you want it to, so when you're ready, you can update DNS records to point to the green stack's load balancer instead of the blue stack's. You can make that flip all at once, or you can make it gradually using Route 53's weighted routing policy. So I know this method sounds a lot like the first one we described, and it is. It's similar, and they share some of the same benefits as well. For example, both the blue and green environments exist side by side. So if you make the switch and then you notice something acting funny, you can update DNS again to route traffic back to the blue environment while you figure things out. This makes your rollback really simple. Of course, once you're confident in the change, you'll want to decommission your blue environment to save costs. There's no reason to keep paying for two environments when one of them is no longer in use. So those are our 5 basic techniques for carrying out blue-green deployments in AWS. There's another important topic I want to cover here too, which is data synchronization and schema changes when it comes to updating applications. No matter what technique you choose to go with when you carry out a blue-green deployment, it's important that both environments have up-to-date data. Your green environment needs it because it's on its way to becoming your production environment, and your blue environment needs it in case you have to roll back. So the easiest way to accomplish this is to have both environments share the same data stores, but I know that's not always easy. For example, one of those data stores might be a relational database management system, where changes to your application might involve changes to a database schema, which can complicate things a little bit when you're trying to have a shared data store across 2 environments that differ from one another. So to remedy this, it's best practice to decouple your schema changes from your code changes using one of the 2 following options. You can change your schema first, as in before the blue-green deployment. If you choose this option, your database updates have to be backward compatible so the old version of the application can still interact with the data in case of a rollback. Schema changes in this approach are typically additive, like adding fields to tables. Alternatively, you can change the schema last, as in after the blue-green deployment is complete. So if you choose this approach, your code changes in the new version of the application must be backward compatible with the way the data used to look in the old version. In this approach, your schema changes are typically deletive, such as removing unneeded fields or relationships, or at least merging them. Sometimes you just can't set things up in a way that you can either share data stores or apply decoupled schema changes from your code changes. If that's the case, then blue-green deployments probably aren't the best answer. There are a couple of other cases where blue-green deployments aren't really a great option as well, and I want to make sure I cover those. One is when your schema changes are too complex to decouple it from the code, and the other is when your blue and green environments are in such drastically different geographic locations that the data locality actually causes such degraded performance that it's unacceptable. So the white paper I got this information from is really great. It's got diagrams for every one of these techniques for carrying out blue-green deployments, and it ends with a big table weighing the costs and benefits of each of these techniques against one another. I definitely recommend you go take a look at it. I'll make sure I link to the article associated with this video, and thanks for watching.